All right. Good morning, everyone. How are you today? Happy spring. It is now springtime. And what a wonderful day to join CRPN Central, the podcast dedicating to bringing you some of the best voices in our industry so that we can tackle the challenges for clinical research, explore something together, and get something done. Just a reminder, CRPN is free for sites to join, free opportunity, free networks, free trials. Whenever sponsors come to me, I want to make sure that the right trials go to you at affordable services. So if you need any help, that's my objective. We want to make sure that you have everything that you and the sponsors need to get something done. How's it going, Mitch?
Going well. Happy Thursday.
Happy Thursday. What a wonderful day. Just so everyone knows, it's Autism Awareness Week. Autism Awareness Month is coming. So any of the neurodivergent populations out there, we really appreciate you. And I think that this podcast in particular can be very, very good for that population.
Yeah, absolutely.
So overall, Mitch, how did you feel about this podcast?
Man, I love all of them. But this one was really, really interesting because I've seen so much of the extreme parallels, right? You always see stuff with sites, advocating for increased patient stipends and really decreasing any burden or excess need put on the patients themselves, right? How do we bridge that gap? But I've also, oddly enough, had an opportunity where I've ran into sites that were concerned because a stipend was increased during the study to be what they felt was almost too much, and they were concerned about undue influence on patients trying to participate in the trial, like lying through a consent process and things like that. So I'm really looking forward to what both of them have to say more about it.
I am too. I love the comparisons. So let's welcome onto stage Miss Felice Anderson from Eclipse Research and Miss KimberLee Heidmann from Scout. Now, KimberLee, is it Scout? Like it's just Scout now, or is it Scout Clinical? I know you just went through a rebranding.
Yeah, it's just Scout now. Now that we've rebranded, but there's we have 3 service lines. So that's Scout Clinical, Scout Meetings, and Scout Academy. But you can refer to this to Scout.
So, Felice, would you be willing to introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, thanks for having me. So I'm Felice. I'm with Eclipse Clinical Research, and we are a small, local, dedicated research site.
Small but mighty.
Small but mighty, yes.
Yes.
So independent is the word I should have used, actually.
So just so everyone knows, Eclipse is in Tucson, Arizona, which just so happens to be the first location of the Save Our Sites conference, which means that I had an opportunity to tour Eclipse. And one of the coolest things ever is the trophy front and center for being one of the best world-class clinical research sites ever. And I can see why. So Felice, so congratulations to Eclipse on all of that you've done, and we really appreciate what you do for this industry.
Thank you. We're really excited to be one of the top sites.
So KimberLee, would you be willing to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much. So my name is KimberLee Heidmann. I am the EVP of Patient Experience and Customer Success here at Scout, and specifically serve across all 3 of those business lines to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all of our clients, which include our patients, our sites, and our sponsors and CROs. So excited. I've really enjoyed talking with the CRPN team and talking more about how we're positioning relieving site burden as well as patient burden and what we can do to support that. So thanks for this.
Absolutely. And KimberLee, I have to say, I am so thankful that the term site burden, I haven't, normally when people say we want to reduce site burden, I think we talked about this, but it triggers this thought in sites like you're just taking work away from us. But to actually look at what sites don't have to carry, what we can do as an industry to support, is just amazing. And I'm looking forward to seeing where Scout is going to be taking this.
Yeah, we're excited about it as well. And, you and I talked about the fact that we can use words, we can use terms, buzzwords, but if we don't put the energy and the effort behind it and actually do the work, then it's just talk. So that's why I appreciate this conversation and specifically, Felice being able to represent these really productive and very, the top rated sites. What is it that's needed? what are we doing to actually bring solutions and not just talk about them? So I appreciate Felice being on as well.
The other thing you touched on during the podcast too, KimberLee, that was phenomenal. Huge fan of the aspect of making sure always we are clearly defining those terms, especially when it came to using stipend versus reimbursement. Because I know it's huge. Anytime you're in like the ClinOps side, you're always talking about like, okay, what's submitted to the IRB? How do we define like a patient stipend? And you take into consideration, reimbursing a patient for their time and travel and things like that. But you're absolutely right. It's not a reimbursement by definition.
Yeah. Defining terms, not only in terms of the financial aspects of what we're doing, it's important in that respect, but also because of what you said, Daniel, which is we need to make sure that companies like Scout are not positioned as taking away or adding burden to the site process. So not taking away from their core competencies, what their responsibilities are, their financial capability on a study. That should never be seen. A company like Scout should never be seen as taking away from that, but rather supporting and augmenting and removing that burden. So we have to define those terms also. What is it that we're actually doing? What is it that the site is actually doing? And then meet to determine what are we going to do to resolve any conflict there that might be perceived conflict, right? So it's not necessarily true that Scout is taking away work, like you said, from the site that might impact them financially. That's not actually the case at all. And so we want to make sure we're defining for everyone what that means so that when they see Scout as a service or service like ours, that you recognize what we're actually going to be doing.
So, and today, and we already kind of started it, but we are going to debrief on the podcast interviews that we had, just so everyone knows. Felice had the interview, KimberLee had the interview. We've never had a chance to sit together and talk about it. One of the coolest analogies that I thought was really neat, and this couldn't have happened in a better time. Okay, so Felice, how many years have you been in the clinical research industry?
25.
What about you, KimberLee?
25.
We won the lottery.
That's
Two
awesome.
people in the industry for 25 years, and we had the opportunity to catch that here on the podcast, which I thought was amazing. So we have a ton of awesome experience right here on this podcast. So let's go ahead and go right into it. So Felice, when you got to hear the podcast, what did you think about your interview versus KimberLee's interview?
So I think the biggest thing that stood out to me was the differences on the site end and what we're seeing versus on the industry end. I think that I learned a lot about Scout in general, and I actually had a conversation with Scout yesterday, which was great. And I think that if we were to work together, we can really change how stipends and reimbursements and all of that work for patients. And I think that's, what our number one goal is. So I was excited to see just those differences and how things are evolving and changing.
You're muted.
You're muted.
I'm muted. I'm getting better. What differences did you identify between like a site facing and a Scout? Like what differences were there?
So I think one of the biggest things, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought, is how the payments are done. I know that we talked about having to wait for sponsor reimbursements in order for patients to be given their stipends. I can't really mention something that it never even occurred to me with when we're using stipend cards, patients maybe trying to use one at a gas station, being able to do that at the site perspective. We've never thought of that. So we issue our stipends immediately. We don't wait for reimbursement from the sponsor, which can sometimes be risky on our end, but it's best for our patients. But we didn't think about some of those logistical things that Scout has thought about and addressed.
And honestly, KimberLee, I learned that too. I didn't realize, and it makes sense. Like sometimes for example, a lot of people, they like to buy like those vanilla cards or Visa gift cards for their kids to do Roblox so they don't get hacked, things like that. They have their limits. And you're right, gas theft is huge. And so they don't allow those one-off kind of gift card things to be at the gas pump. You have to go inside to do it. Most vendors won't do that. So that was one of the biggest lessons that I learned. I also really enjoyed the conversation about understanding what it takes to identify that stipend before a contract is seen by the site. Never realized how much had to be done on the back end, where Scout is making predictions, sponsors make all these things happen on the back end. By the time it hits the site, you're probably at like a final draft, and it's really, really hard to change that because you've got everyone in line. So then when you have the site coming in saying, no, it's like, I think we talked about this, but I wonder why they can't bring sites in on that conversation in the early stages. But every site's different, I guess.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I found, between our conversations and just the perspectives, is that there's so much to be learned. At Scout, we think we know because we talk to sites every day. But really, when you sit down and you have this type of conversation, it's a completely different way of looking at it. We're not talking about a particular study today. We're not talking about a particular sponsor. We're just talking in general about how the sites are handling this and the perspectives, as well as what Scout's doing. And so we're uncovering a lot more to develop that relationship by having this type of conversation. So I think, what Felice brings and her perspective and the differences between, there's a lot that I don't know, Daniel, that we've talked about in terms of, we know a lot about CTAs, and we have legal counsel, and we have folks that are focused on understanding that. But you all bring a completely different perspective to how we need to understand that. So I thought that was very helpful. And also just understanding that maybe we do need to have a conversation about how we can bring the site perspective into that earlier conversation about the stipends. Because to be quite honest with you, there are times when we go into a study and we have the stipends or the reimbursement or the travel and reimbursement policy is in place between the sponsor and the CRO and Scout. But then when those go to the sites, it almost feels like with the site that they're surprised. And I would love to see a reduction of that, where it's much more turnkey, and the sites are saying, yes, we understand this. This is what we've grown to appreciate and expect from Scout and our relationship, so that it's not a surprise. That I would like to eliminate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a phrase I've been using lately for various reasons, and this applies perfectly here too, is that it's almost like putting together a puzzle, but you don't have all the pieces. That site piece is so important, because that's where those patient interactions are coming from.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Everyone, go ahead, Felice.
I think that, KimberLee, you hit the nail on the head. I think the site is surprised. By the time it comes to the site, it's already gone through sponsor, CRO, Scout, if the sponsor is using Scout, and the site is told this is what, the site's told this is what we're offering. And sometimes that does take us by surprise. So it would be nice to be part of the conversation and be able to say, no, this is what our participants need.
Mm-hmm. And it's cool. So I hope you're both sitting down. I just had a conversation with Brad Hightower on Tuesday on his live event, and he was noting that there are actually sponsors right now, as of this week, who come to sites and say, we don't want to do stipends anymore. No stipends at all. So the pendulum is going the other way with some of the sponsors, which is highly concerning to me for the quality of the research. Have you seen any of this happen in your experience?
I'm actually seeing stipends go down. I have not seen them say we don't want them. Actually, I have to take that back. We're doing one trial that's just one visit, a very quick in and out. And the sponsor said no stipends on that one. We did fight back. They would not budge. They said, it's just a one-time thing. But we are seeing the levels go down, which is a big problem for us because patient expenses are going up. And the cost of participating for our patient is going up.
What about you, KimberLee? What do you see?
Yeah, I'm a little, I'm not totally surprised, because the conversation about stipends is a very complex one. And there are various pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies that have very differing opinions. I will tell you that I know for a fact. I can have a conversation with one company and they take one perspective, and then have another conversation with an equally sized company and they'll have a completely different perspective on this. So we talked a little bit before about how the pendulum is swinging, and we've got to find the sweet spot of actually meeting the patient needs and also following our requirements and our regulations globally as well. What I think is concerning is if there is a shift farther away from making patients whole financially by providing for this. That is concerning, because we all know, even the four of us here and everyone else listening, the cost of living is going up. Everything costs more today. A loaf of bread costs more than it did before. My husband and I were just in a very small town in South Texas for spring break, and every day the town, instead of putting out the NASDAQ or putting out information about stocks and bonds, they put out information as a community about how much eggs cost, how much milk costs, how much bread costs. So
because it may as well be a stock price.
It
just keeps fluctuating.
That's right. It's cost of living. And so, to your point, Felice, we have to be proactive. So if sponsors have specific requirements and they don't want to use stipends, and again, we defined our terms. If they don't want to use stipends, then we've got to support the patients by coordinating that logistics and paying for it for them, or reimbursing their out of pocket. We have to have some sort of alternative. And that's what I would probably argue with the sponsors is, and in a kind and nice way, is that we want to offer you an alternative. If you're not comfortable with the stipends, let's do it another way so that we can still achieve what we need to for the patients.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could pay the sites more, and then the sites, it's a responsibility to make sure the patients get paid.
So I think the only issue we have with that, and we're, as a site, we're fine with that. If the line item isn't for a stipend or a reimbursement, and we have to take that out of pocket and add the cost somewhere else to overhead or another line item, we're fine with that. But what we're seeing is pushback as, we won't approve your ICFs, or we won't approve if you put that in there.
Yep.
So then it's not that it's even costing the sponsor money, it's they just don't want us paying it. And so we are working on that. We're coming up with, like I said, it's very new. We are coming up with internal ways to address it as it comes up, but it's surprising to me. It's not something I expected to see.
I could see it turning into a part of a feasibility eventually, where a site interviews a sponsor and says, do you allow stipends, yes or no? And if it's no, well, that doesn't adhere to our quality standards on how we want to treat our patients. Because realistically, when push comes to shove, it's not going to be the person who signs the paycheck that's going to have to look at the patient in the eyes and say, thank you for all you do. Thanks for earning someone else a bunch of money. It's going to be the site. Even on a legal premise, and this goes into the independent contractor stage, it is the ultimate responsibility of the site to ensure that the patients they are engaging with, because the site is the independent contractor, the site must ensure this. So that there's a really, really big thing here. I did want to mention KimberLee and Felice. I'm working right now with a government agency like NIH, groups like that, and they offer, they have this link that you click on, and it tells by city, and this goes back to where Felice was saying, it tells by city what the government approved per diems are for gas, hotel, travel, how much you get for a meal, by city, and not just by city, but by date. You click the date that you're going to be traveling, and it tells you what the city is and how much the NIH will approve for per diem. So there's some really interesting public databases out there that set things like per diem, stipends, travel already. The databases are out there. That's how the government reimburses in its grant systems. So do you think there's ever a way, since there's a standardized database out there for reimbursements, we could try to tap into that for clinical research?
So I think something like that would be great. And I think it brings up another point, which you saying that it sorts it by date. And this is something that I don't think is addressed enough, if at all, is when we're doing contracts and we're looking at stipends, we can have 3, 4, even 5-year studies, and that stipend is the same from day 1 to year 5. So we
No
need to
colas at
address that as
all.
well,
Yep.
because it's
Yep.
not addressing the cost of living increases or the cost of fuel and things like that.
Mm-hmm. So what about you, KimberLee?
Yeah. In fact, we've had some talks about it with sponsors and with sites about is there a tool that could be created to help evaluate what the cost would be potentially for a patient, and then how we can offset that. And that's something that we've done a lot of research into. And actually at our company, that's part of what we were talking about those early stages, is that we make recommendations. And a lot of that is based on public information, right? We know, obviously you can click on that for NIH. We know what the mileage rates are. We know how the United States does mileage rates. And in fact, that's done all over the world. So if you want to look at how much mileage should be reimbursed, that's global. You can find that out globally. But I think that there are so many variables. So when a sponsor or someone says to us, well, we want to calculate how much this is potentially going to cost a patient to participate in this trial. If you think about it, there are so many variables on that. Look at the study design. How many days are these patients going to be required to be at clinic? Are they going to have home visits? Are they going to have telephone visits? How much impact does that have on their time and wage loss, right? Are they going to have to take off of work? If you're going to a screening visit that's going to take you 4 hours, you have to take a half a day of work. If you're an hourly employee, that's very different than if you're a salaried employee. So how do we calculate these types of things? And we don't want to get down so far into the weeds that we're creating some very complex, overly complicated process, but we do need something that at least guides us on how we can manage this. So I think that's the conversation that we're having right now is, and you're bringing up a very good point about the NIH calculator. How can we actually use this and leverage this to show the sponsors what this will mean for patients? But like Felice said, like, what does it mean today? But what does it mean in 2 years? So it does have to be flexible. I think this is a challenging and complicated thing, but we have to put the energy behind solving it.
And go ahead, Mitch. You look like you want to say something.
Obviously the task of that burden has obviously been put on sponsors and CROs in collaboration to come up with those prices initially to even present to the sites. But I think from my perspective, it would actually be genuinely nice to see more of the IRB aspect involved in making sure those prices are better regulated and controlled, because that's the entire concept of the IRBs to begin with, is to make sure those patient rights are protected, and that absolutely aligns with a patient's rights in my mind as well.
And we're going to go into, I have a couple really cool questions to ask, but I do want to cover some of these questions. Thank you so much for everyone for joining live. This is why we're doing it, is we want to interact with you. So first and foremost, I love this comparison that reimbursement typically covers things that happen outside of the protocol. That makes sense, like the travel, getting there, and what might happen. While as a stipend covers the protocol expectations. That's one way. I never thought about it like that. I always thought reimbursement was out of pocket. You spend money, you're asking for it back. Whereas a stipend is no questions asked. Like, here's a stipend. Thank you for doing what you're doing. But structuring it like that is a very interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, I would answer that just to provide some extra clarity. So there are, if you look globally, and I know we're talking, a lot about the United States, but if you look globally, there are some requirements on what stipends can be used for. So in many cases, they are isolated to travel and meal stipends. So they are particularly associated with that. But the distinction goes both ways, because obviously we can't reimburse for protocol expectations. And so your time and wage loss compensation would be associated with those extended visits, or perhaps a complicated assessment or a more invasive assessment like an infusion or a biopsy or something like that. So I agree, there's a distinction there, because obviously we can't reimburse for things that are protocol related. So there is, I think the thing to remember about that is that they're not mutually exclusive. So there are many sponsors that will offer both. They will offer the travel and meal reimbursement or coordination, and they will offer a stipend. And I don't know, Dan, if you remember, but that's one of the things that I brought up that I advocate for. And we advocate for here at Scout is it should not just be to relieve the travel and financial burden of getting there and participating, but there should be some sort of compensation via a stipend for what this user is talking about with the protocol expectations.
Yep. And Felice, I am sure that when we talk about this, the way I see it is I see it as how I read it in the CTA. And the CTA is always, every CTA is different. We know that. But there's some sponsors that have the patient stipend in the schedule of assessments. It's just right there. Boom. It gets paid automatically into the visit. Some sponsors don't like that because that actually accrues overhead. So they'd rather carve it out as an itemized invoice. That way they don't have to accrue overhead. Whereas some do stipend. Some call inconvenience, some call it travel, some say travel, it could be at sponsor approval. Like let's say that you have a patient that's 4 hours away and it's an exception to their rules, you have to get special sponsor permissions. As like the variability of how it's structured in a CTA is just
and we see it both ways.
Crazy.
We see it both ways. I actually have one now that has both. There's a stipend in the schedule of events, and then there's a separate invoiceable depending on what one is a compliance, so it's invoiceable. I think it also comes down to the wording in the ICF. I think that's just as important as the CTA.
And that gets, and I did want to cover the questions. So there's a LinkedIn user asking about CRPN and CRPN Central. Hey, if you want to get involved, send me a message on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to have a discussion with you. Jeffrey Smith, how's it going, Jeff? He said, why? Honestly, Jeff, I don't remember why you said why, because it's been a while back.
That was related to the why, why we're seeing like Hightower's mention of.
Oh, why are we going backwards on stipends?
I think it's a good ethical question, right? It would be good to know kind of where the root of that why, like what is the justification for suddenly not having patient stipends?
I mean, my knee-jerk reaction just says cut costs. But then what Jeff says is exactly the response you'd have, as if recruitment isn't difficult enough. I think that the people who make the decision not to pay patients are not the same people who are trying to recruit patients. Felice, what would happen if you went to all your patients and said, hey, you want to join this trial just for the heck of it? By the way, you don't get anything out of it. You have to take off work. You have to find childcare, all this stuff. And we thank you for your service. What do you think would happen?
We wouldn't have any patients. So, there's one or two here and there that say, I don't care about being reimbursed. I don't care about stipends. I just want to do it for the science. That's few and far between. These people want and they should be reimbursed for their time and taking time off of work and childcare and anything that is involved with doing the study, including time it takes to fill out e-diaries and things like that.
Yeah, and even those patients who are, we have a lot of patients that this is their only choice, right? The clinical research as care is a real thing. And even those folks who are dedicated and they're like, I want my family member or I want my own self to have access to this care. If that financial burden or that time burden is so great that they just can't complete, now we've started with a patient, but they just don't have the means to complete the study. Now we're really in trouble, right? Because we have to replace that patient, but also all the time and energy and everything for that patient that went into it up to that point. So, it's, and when you're a patient, I'm just going to, switch to a personal side here. If you have a loved one or you're a patient and you're looking for a study, you have to, as someone who doesn't have access to the protocol, doesn't have, if any of us were going to be on a trial or our loved ones were going to be on a trial, we would know what to look for in an ICF. I know how to read the schedule of assessments. I know what questions to ask. With all of that knowledge, I still look at those ICFs when presented by a site. Here's your options of the trials for your loved one. I still look at that and say, okay, which one is going to have, which one can I comply with? Which one is going to have the least financial burden on me? Which sponsor is going to help me out? These are things that patients are considering when they're looking at trials for sites.
Yeah.
And there are other benefits to participating that we're not talking about. So there's the blood work that they get and the medical testing and the exams. And there have been a lot of times that through trials we have diagnosed things that
Yep.
personal physicians have missed. So we can't make light of that and say it's all about the stipends, because there are the other benefits, but the stipends are important. They absolutely are.
Oh yeah, 100%. And you're right. We've done it too. We have a patient come in for a dermatology study, and turns out we found something else, and it ended up having to go to a specialist. And they were so thankful that we caught it because we were so thorough as a site. We found this, and then it actually saved their life. And I'm sure you've seen that as well.
I have, and there's that benefit to having a screening visit that's 2-3 hours, and that one-on-one time with the patient that they don't get going into a doctor's office when they're in and out in 5 or 10 minutes.
Yep, I agree completely. And I did want to talk about this, but I think Felice, you touched on this. I think that patients tend to get kind of bitter when they see big national global reports about pharmaceutical companies making millions and millions of billions of dollars, where they get to the point where they feel used. I've been doing this for 2 years. I've been helping with this, and they don't even want to give me $25 for every visit.
Right.
And now look at all of the money that they're pocketing. That's the patient participant perspective
Mhm.
of the industry. So now you're breaking trust.
Yes.
And I mean, without saying, okay, without undue coercion, right? We don't want to, no one's going to get rich being a participant in clinical research. But how do you find that balance between helping the participants feel appreciated for the work that they're doing, for their efforts, and at the same time appeasing the sponsors who, this is their investment in their product, their drug? Where do you think we can find the balance for that?
You really have to. It comes down to treating the patients fairly and as human beings. So again, to us, yes, they're study participants, but they're patients. So we make sure that we treat them as they're cared about. We have conversations with them about their families, about their life, make them know or feel that they want to be here, they want to participate, but it is very important to compensate them.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we don't want to coerce them. We don't want to give them $1,000 to come in and just do a screening visit, but they do see how much the pharmaceutical companies make. They don't understand for the, main part what it costs to bring a drug to market. But when, a big pharma reports profits of $1 billion, they have questions. So, and they should be compensated for their time fairly. And
What
I think
about
that goes a long way to earning the patient's trust and making them feel that, it's not just pharma's getting rich from them,
mhm.
that
That's a
they're getting something out of it too.
that's a big relationship builder
Mhm.
right there. It's
Yep.
all about that relationship.
Yep.
So, Mitch, Kimberly, what do you see across the industry as far as that dynamic goes?
Well, I have questions actually for Felice in terms of how you bridge that gap, because having that conversation is not simple, and helping people understand what actually goes into research and overcoming that. I think probably you have some wonderful experiences that other people at sites would appreciate, how they can have that conversation with the patient, because these are human beings. Like you said, we need to treat them like human beings. And patients have the choice of sometimes patients have a choice of which site to participate. Here in Dallas, Texas, we have wonderful research sites that are conducting the same studies, and so we do have the ability to choose which site. And if I went to Felice's site, that's going to be the site I'm going to want to go with, right? The one that is explaining this to me, helping me understand, and saying, yes, we understand that the compensation or the offset, the cost neutrality of this might be a little lower, but here's what you're getting in addition to this, and we want to help you. that right there is going to make a huge difference. So, talking about recruitment being difficult, I think Felice has just brought up a massive topic that needs to be discussed is how are we having this discussion about finances, but also about care as well. And so I love that. I'm fascinated by that and appreciate that you brought that up.
Thank you. So we actually, to go a little more into detail about it, we talk about, how their participation can change the future of medicine is how we word it to patients. So, and we're very honest, especially with placebo trials, that they may not see a benefit. And we tell them, even if you're not on a placebo, and we don't know that with a double-blind trial, you may not see a benefit. Do we know if this medication necessarily works? No, that's why we're doing the trial. That's one of the things we're looking at is efficacy. So while you may not see a benefit personally, you're contributing and you're helping down the line. And you may see something, 5 or 10 years from now that helps your children, your grandchildren, a relative. You're also, again, like I said, you're getting that exam, you're getting labs that may not otherwise be drawn. So we are routinely drawing blood and checking things that are not normally checked in, with an annual physical. And that finds things. We will send copies of their EKGs to their doctors, with their permission. So that care is really emphasized. And we take that time. We will schedule patients a little longer if we know that, a lot of our studies involve elderly patients, retired patients, that this is their outing. So if they want to sit and chit chat with the coordinators for a while, we will schedule that in, build that in so that that care is given and they feel wanted, they feel welcome. In addition to those stipends, it's just so important. But we also will go to bat with those stipends. And as we see them decreasing, we push back and push back. And we're actually trying to increase stipends.
Yeah, I love how that came up. The care and compassion and empathy for the patients. It came up in the recent Other Live podcast about budgets, and being able to allocate that time, because it's not something that's normally considered, is you're going to spend that extra time with your patients. Phenomenal. You're so passionate. I love that.
Thank you. It's also important in when you talk about budgets, I know that there's pushback from the sponsors is they probably don't want to include that in the time it takes per se for a visit. But when you're looking at long-term retention, it makes an enormous difference. So if a patient doesn't feel wanted, doesn't feel valued, they're going to drop out versus a patient that may not be getting a benefit efficacy wise, but feels that they're participating and they're cared about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You don't want to make it feel like a burden ever.
Right. Yep.
100%. And I think maybe that's actually valuable just as much as a stipend is appreciation. It's a lot of sites out there, they'll stock their waiting room with snacks.
They do that.
Yep. They'll do whatever it takes to help the patients feel like they're going into a welcoming environment of professionals who truly appreciate them.
Yeah, it's what I tell my staff and we tell, everyone in training is these people don't have to be here. They are volunteering, they're taking their time. We want them to be appreciated and feel appreciated. So yeah, we do. We have coffee in our lobby. We have a basket full of snacks. We're actually doing an expansion and we're putting in a coffee bar with snacks and a refrigerator. The only thing we ask is they don't touch it until they have their fasting labs drawn.
Makes sense.
That makes total sense. I wonder, Felice, and this is something that I have to ask, have you ever eaten the costs of a stipend to hold on to your patients, even though the sponsors did not pay for it?
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Absolutely.
Even though the sponsors didn't pay for it, you're like, this is for the patient. We're going to eat this.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And KimberLee, have you ever seen that too across the industry? Like sites that just like, you know what? Screw the sponsor. We've got to take care of our patients. We're just going to eat it.
We've heard that. And in fact, at SOS, I had conversations with sites that had, that were saying, look, we want to solve a problem. We have a problem we need to solve and we need your help because they specifically had that problem. And then we were talking on the SOS webinar that we did, a webcast that we did, where, you know, Dan was saying that he paid for the Uber for his patient as well. So it's not just the stipends. It's, you know, I think the sites are absorbing costs a lot of times across these types of things. And I would be curious to know from Felice, you know, I think this opens up a conversation, not only the absorption of the costs and the stipends, but you guys are investing a lot of money at the end of the day in the snacks and in the personnel, right? It takes people to make this happen. And so we would like to relieve the burden of the processing of the stipend, the financial overhead. I've talked to recently a very large site that actually has full-time employees that are dedicated to processing stipends and reimbursements because it takes so long to upload receipts and do all these things. And so what we want to do is pull that off of you so that you can put the energy into time with the patients, because we don't want you spending time, you know, making a payment. We want you spending time with those patients.
So, and I think that it's so involved that could be its own podcast. But I think that one thing I wanted to touch on is that when we absorb the cost of a stipend or we absorb the cost of an Uber or food, we're thinking of more than just that study. So we're thinking that, you know, when this patient finishes, they may come do another study, you know, 30 days after. They're going to refer friends. If they have a good experience, we're going to get more patients and more business. So sometimes we have to weigh that against, are we going to be reimbursed from the sponsor? And it's actually a situation we're dealing with now where a sponsor doesn't want to pay stipends, which again could be another podcast. But and I lost my train of thought with your other question. I'm sorry. Can you tell me what it was again, KimberLee?
No, just wondering about what your perspective is on the cost that you're incurring for all these other things and outsourcing the payments and the logistics and all of that to a company like Scout. That's somewhere where we kind of see a gap. Sometimes the sites don't see the value as much there. But when I look and I talk to sites about how much energy and time and work you're putting into the other pieces, what I want to say is just let me do the rest, right? Let our staff do this for you because they want to do it for you. So your perspective on that. Basically.
So for us, and again, we're a very small site, it's not a lot. We use a company similar to Scout, and we do reimbursement cards. And basically, I set it up at the beginning of the study, and it takes maybe 10, 15 minutes. And then my coordinators just have to go in and click a button to issue the stipends. We don't do a lot of receipt reimbursements at this point, but it's something that we're working on adding into new contracts. So honestly, it's something I wasn't aware of before SOS. I had never thought to ask for childcare reimbursement. I had never thought to ask for certain things like meal reimbursement unless they're on site for 7-8 hours. So it's things that now we're looking at, and that may change. The processes may become more time consuming as we incorporate that into new contracts.
The process of like your coordinators are the ones stocking the break rooms and the coffee bars, and so who does all of the legwork for that?
So I usually do that, and I will, you know, just grab stuff on Amazon or at Costco when I'm there anyway. So that's not too much, but I guess, you know, now that I think about it, it is time. It adds up.
So eventually you'll be the barista and I can come get a coffee drink from you, right?
Absolutely. Next time you're here.
Yeah, well, yeah, we'll make sure we do that. I do want to touch one more thing, and this is the big hot item. And anyone watching this, I do recommend that you contact your representatives and your legislation right now. Patients are the heroes of this country. COVID has demonstrated it. Patients are literally the heroes of the future. And there are avenues that we as a government can utilize to make sure that the amounts of money that they receive for being a patient are tax exempt. And that's the big push, is how do you feel, like from your experience on the front lines, Felice, with this problem with taxes on stipends, and from your experience, KimberLee, on the global level, like where we're literally trying to lobby the government to try to fix this. Where do you think we are in this initiative?
So this is so important, and I can't stress it enough. And it's not just taxes. I know we always think about it as, do we have to issue a 1099? Have they hit that $600 a year mark? But we have had patients on government benefits that have lost their cash assistance, or they have lost their food benefits, or Medicaid, because their stipend has pushed them $50 over their monthly allowance in income. So it's very, very important that we find ways to make it to where that they don't have to report that as income. We either will lose the patient, or they'll come to us and say, "Help me. What do I do?"
Oh my gosh.
I mean, you can't pay them less,
No,
I mean,
and we've been in the same, Felice, we've had the same situation where a patient says, well, I'm going to decline, to accept these taxable payments because there's a potential. And then you have patients that don't know, right? We have to disclose this information. Scout's very serious about how we disclose things about tax related information, benefits. We want patients to understand that before they do that. But that's why between this conversation, what Felice is bringing up, which is very real and very serious, and then also the shift that Brad was talking about and that we're talking about away from stipends, we have to have those alternatives. And that goes back to what Felice was saying about, okay, right now we're, flipping a switch and handing a card, but that may not be something that is applicable for all studies going forward. And you may have, what about those patients that decline the stipend and say, well, I can't afford to lose my benefits? What are we doing for them? So I think this is a really important conversation. We have to be aware of what's changing in terms of, are the sponsors shifting away from the stipends because they don't want to deal with the tax reporting implications? I've heard that a lot of the sites, when sites are making these payments, it's on the sites to have to issue the 1099s or do it. That's another added burden that takes a lot of effort. It's not a simple, easy thing to do, especially if you have patients that are maybe participating in multiple studies. There's so many things to consider. And when you ask about the global implications, these types of payments are not always taxable all over the world, but we need to be focused on where they are. And then to Felice's point, what about the other issues? Not just the tax issue, but what about the rest of it? And so we have to be ahead of it. And I think there is a big push in the industry from partners like Scout to really pay attention to this. We're all on the same page. I will tell you that this, I think all of us, sites, CROs, third-party vendors, that this needs to stop in terms of the taxable payment.
It's one thing to keep a patient whole when they're part of a trial. It's another thing to ask them or expect them or have them do things out of pocket to be part of a trial. And it's a completely different thing to literally punish a participant for being a part of research. That there's no way in the world anyone would agree to that ever. And we've got to get that part fixed. Another part that really inspired me, Felice, when you were saying like what you as a site, when you eat the cost of a participant stipend, you are creating an environment that creates almost like a community loyalty to research. Like they're going to tell their friends, they're going to want to be a part of research, they're going to want to help you. It puts participant stipends into a completely different bin as far as a business goes. Let's talk about participant stipends as an investment into our industry, which the way that you are structuring it, that's kind of what we're looking at. You are investing in something that will grow into an opportunity later. So how do you feel about that as like a business development tool?
So again, I think it's a great idea. I think that the problems that we see is not that well, there's the problem with the sponsors not wanting to pay it. And if we absorb it, if we put it, into overhead or business development, or, we throw it somewhere else under another line item, we can do that on the site end and look at it as an investment. However, we still have to get the sponsors to agree that it can be paid. And I think it comes down to that. I've never had an IRB say, you're paying too high of a stipend. But I have had a sponsor say that. And if they don't approve our consent wording, then we can't pay it, regardless of what the IRB says. And we've had those conversations with sponsors where the sponsor has said, you know, it's unethical, you're paying too much. Our ethics boards say this, and we come back with, but the IRB allows it. And the sponsors just say, well, we're sorry. So, you know, no matter how we use it as an investment, where we put it, even if we took a loss on it, we still have to get their approval one way or another, or it just can't happen.
Well,
which
okay,
is
but
unfortunate.
they're not going to approve your coffee bar,
Right.
right? So maybe that's the question: is what can sites do that sponsors don't have to approve?
So I think that's different than a stipend per se. And the reasoning behind that is the coffee bar is not for a specific study. We're not saying if you complete this visit, you can use our coffee bar. With the stipends, we're saying, oh, well, the sponsor only wants to pay $50. We'll give 100 and we'll absorb the other 50. But if we're still issuing it as a stipend, it still comes down to it being approved. So then we have to get creative. We have to look at, you know, GCP and other regulations and say, how can we reimburse a patient without it being specific to the study? Can we say, come in and talk to us about research, tour our facility, you know, let us maybe do blood pressure screenings for you or cholesterol screenings for you, and we'll give you a gift card for your time. Outside of a specific study.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to look at that. You have to get creative and figure out how you can do that.
I think it's interesting too, is, you know, obviously there's the benefit, right? From the site perspective, and you're communicating with your patients, there's a huge benefit of running these labs that they might not get, and you can help diagnose things that they might not have otherwise found, right? You pointed to that earlier. But the interesting aspect is that everything that's being done on those trials is required to be done by the sponsor. So they need that to get their approval, you know. So to pull back on a stipend because, you know, if there's an element of referencing the patient benefit or, you know, whatever's being done at the site level or the services that are being paid for and covered, they also need it. So I wouldn't look at it from too much of a perspective of, you know, well, they're offering this service and benefit. Well, they need it for themselves too.
Well, and when we're looking at the overall scheme of a study and the overall cost of a study, if the sponsor's offering a $50 stipend and we say we want it increased to 100, any site, you know, if you have 30 sites, that's not going to increase the overall cost of the trial that much.
Right. Especially if you can shorten the time of being in the trial. It'll be an investment. Again, so stipends as investments for sponsors. It's not just for sites.
Absolutely.
You're investing in quality research because of the people who are helping to collect the data.
Absolutely. And again, if you keep those participants happy, they're more likely to finish, and you improve your retention, and then you improve your overall study results.
Yeah. So it's a necessary evil.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know we have a hard stop here in 6 minutes, and I want to be very respectful of everyone's time. And we don't want anyone to be late for their meetings.
Thank you.
If I had a microphone right now, and I do, it's right here, you don't see it. And I wanted to say, what would you like to tell the entire industry about patient stipends, about what we can do to help to make a better industry with patient stipends? What would you tell them?
So I think I would say that we just need to make sure that we are being respectful of the cost involved for patients. We need to adequately reimburse that. We need to do it on a timely manner. And I think that as long as we keep those things in mind, we're going to have more and more participants. And we're also going to have them be more compliant, which is going to benefit everybody.
Oh, yeah. Compliance is key.
Yep,
always.
Absolutely.
KimberLee, what about you?
Yeah, I agree. And I would say also that we need to have a discussion about all of the tools that are at our discretion to use in order to keep the participants engaged and for that compliance. And Felice has brought up some wonderful very tangible things that can be done in addition to the stipends. But also I think we need to listen. There's been a lot of stuff brought up today about potential, impact on stipends and their availability. Let's be proactive and think about the solutions. Should we have some impact on, lesser stipends or fewer stipends, or if we don't make good headway with the taxable payments issue, let's be proactive and use the tools at our resource to support the patients and their families.
Yep. Perfect. And Mitch?
Yeah, KimberLee, you definitely nailed kind of the point that I was going to get to as well. Following SOS specifically, the beauty of that this year absolutely does seem like it's continuing to be the year of the sites. So advocate for your patients, advocate for proper stipends, continue the conversation, have these discussions because it is important, it is impactful. And there's companies trying to do good and improve budgets and stipends and things like that. CRPN, shameless plug.
Yay, CRPN. I'm here to help, here to serve. And just a reminder, if anyone didn't have a chance to hear this interview, at the very end, there's a wrap up and has 3 things to really focus on for participant stipends. 1 was flexibility, 2 was understanding, and 3 was compassion. And I think all of those put together, if we focused on just those 3, if we could just get those 3 up and running, maybe we could try to make this industry a better place. We're going to leave. We have a hard stop. Thank you so much for following. Like, comment, subscribe. Your voice is important. Do not let it be muffled. I know it gets loud out there, but do not let it be muffled. And we'll see you again next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.